Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Rehash, a Web3 podcast. I'm your host, Diana Chen, and today we're speaking with Toby Shorin, Lotti, and Sam Hart from the Other Internet team about their most recent article on crypto's three-body problem. We're also clarifying some common misconceptions about headless brands, and we're also getting their take on the current state of onchain culture. The idea for this collaboration or this interview came about initially when we had Jon Wu on the podcast last season in season 8, episode 4, which aired on May 9th, 2024. In that episode, Jon criticized the concept of a headless brand that was coined by the Other Internet team back in 2019. And Toby Shorin responded that Jon's interpretation of headless brands was not actually what the authors had intended when they wrote the article. Since I also had some similar misconceptions that Jon had, and honestly, that many people I speak to have as well, I thought it would be most appropriate and productive if we brought the authors of that piece onto the podcast to clarify some of the common misconceptions that people have around this idea of a headless brand. I feel like I definitely have a clearer understanding of headless brands after this conversation, and hopefully you will as well. We then get into their latest article on crypto's three-body problem. And once again, I came in with all the misconceptions and misunderstandings, which the Other Internet team did a great job of clearing up for me. I did apologize to them afterwards for misinterpreting a lot of their writings, but figured that if I had certain questions about something or wasn't understanding something properly, that others probably had the same questions, were in the same boat. So I'm just glad we had a chance to talk through some of those things and hopefully give all of you some more context and a better understanding of their latest piece as well. Finally, I had to ask Sam about a pretty spicy tweet he put out recently that called out a lot of current on-chain culture for being, quote, completely soulless and, quote, a cultural wasteland. Sam explained some of his thinking around that, and the team also talked about why they believe we should stop talking about, quote, the space, referencing the crypto space, and onboarding the next billion to crypto, and what we should be talking about instead. Toby, Laura, and Sam were nominated for Rehash by myself, Diana Chen, and voted onto the podcast by Richie Bonilla, Triumph, Fifth World Zach, Tim Black, Verb, Amy Jung, Rachel Amy, and Anasim. Hope you enjoy this conversation. We have today Toby Shorin, Lotti, and Sam Hart joining us from the Other Internet team. I'm so excited to have you guys here with me today. I think a couple of things that I want to hit on today. Mostly I want to hit on your most recent article, Crypto's Three-Body Problem, which I don't believe I personally haven't heard any of you guys talk about on a podcast or an interview or anything like that, unless I missed it. But I haven't heard anything about that. So I'm excited to be talking with you guys for the first time about that. And I also want to speak to you just in general about on-chain culture, since you guys are kind of the leading thinkers and researchers on that topic. But before we dive into all of that, I want to start out with just responding to something that Jon Wu said on the podcast last season. He was on season 8. It was episode 4. He is an early stage investor. He's pretty well known on crypto Twitter, but he said something about the headless brands concept that shed light on the headless brands concept is actually an often misconstrued idea. So I think people hear headless brands. A lot of people haven't even read the essay on it. They just hear headless brands and they think, in the most literal sense, what does that mean? Like a brand without a person behind it. So I was wondering if Toby or the team could help clarify, some of those common misconceptions that you've heard of this headless brands concept and explain to us what that really means.
This article did really well in the agency world because agencies are always looking for new ways to brand things. One misconception was what headless brand means generative identity system, which is a trend that I think may have started with like the MIT Media Lab brand identity many years ago. Remixable logos, remixable word marks, visual identity systems that like have an infinite array of lockups and arrangements. So one misconception was headless brand was just taken as like further justification for that.
I mean, the most common one that I think I've heard of is just that people take headless brands as this thing that, like, they take it as you're saying that a brand does not need to have a person behind it. And I think especially recently, there's been more of a push towards, people like to invest in people, not companies. People like to follow people, not companies, all these things. And so I think then this misconstrued headless brands idea gets put under a lot of fire for that.
I think that's the correct interpretation. It really is trying to remove the singular entity, the singular founder. One of the things that we talk about in the essay is kind of like this like Satoshi type phenomenon where there is still a kind of figurehead or symbolic, godlike figure, which is like an important emotional touch point and does have that symbolic weight to it. If you have a successful headless brand, you can potentially transcend a singular human entity that's like pushing the brand, and it's just a fully distributed and emergent system past that.
In a sense, I guess the thing about headless brands that maybe hasn't been understood very well is that it's not just a brand without a person. It's a brand with like too many people behind it that create or feed and fuel this like decentralized kind of narrative formation. In a sense, I think Bitcoin maybe has the most famous example of a headless brand is that in a sense it's kind of the unintended consequence of a lot of localized, very intentional outcomes at pushing certain kind of narratives that then altogether kind of converge or like kind of gave rise to this kind of brand formation without really a single direction in a sense. It seems that, I don't know, often we've heard in crypto a lot of agencies and marketing teams wanting to create headless brands, and that's not exactly the approach.
Maybe just one last word on it is I think we wrote it as much more of a descriptive, like an is statement than an ought statement. And naturally, people want to emulate Bitcoin. They want to emulate Ethereum. So they took it as an instruction. But if you look at other things that look a lot like headless brands that were in our private conversations at the time were like fandoms, for example. Like Kara from the Other Internet Squad knows a lot about the sorts of decentralized narrative formations that happen around fandom communities and fan fiction communities that in ways like overtake like the creator's intention of what happens with those stories and narratives. And the same kinds of phenomena apply in those categories too. I think it might be better to think about headless brands as more of a tool for understanding the types of decentralized narrative formation dynamics that are happening today, rather than as something to like try to build towards. Not that it's impossible. The loot thing at one time, the Milady community at another time, like reproduce certain qualities of this. But I think what we described is like an ideal type, basically. Very few things will approach the actual ideal type in reality.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think just to rehash this conversation a little bit, I think like where the confusion lies with a lot of people who, I think it is an easier concept to understand if you're already in the crypto space, because like you said, it is like a decentralized type of brand making process. But I think for people who come from maybe a Web2 or a traditional tech space, it can be a little easier to misconstrue because they think in this binary of like this brand is either founder led or it is, not founder led and therefore has no identity or has a very kind of stale corporate identity. And so I think that's what people who don't understand what you're actually referencing might think you mean by headless brand is that because it's not single founder led, that it is this stale corporate type of brand. And that's not at all what you guys are saying. It's in fact this more decentralized concept of brand making that you're advocating for it as a headless brand. So that I think, thank you guys for clarifying that. And hopefully that clarifies it for listeners as well who were not so sure what you meant by the headless brands thing. I want to move on from that and talk about your latest article, which you published earlier this year. And it's called Crypto's Three Body Problem. I think where I want to start is maybe if you could just explain what this three-body problem references just in physics or in general before we dive into your specific essay on crypto's three-body problem. So one of you, if you'd like to explain just what we're referencing with the three-body problem in general.
Yeah, I'm happy to take this. So the idea in physics of a three-body problem, it's a system in which you are inducing chaotic motion. So if you think about the bodies as planets and their orbits around one another, they each have pairwise interactions with each other, and they are pulling, their gravitational pull is interacting with the other two bodies. And so this is very challenging to model and enters what is called a chaotic state, which actually has a different formal mathematical definition. That just seems like a apt metaphor to deploy for the state that we're in. It's crypto protocols where there is no overarching kind of meta regulatory force, the law, which is able to kind of stabilize the interactions and give them behavioral regulatory system, additional kind of structure and order.
And what are the three bodies in crypto?
The three bodies in crypto that we're referring to are, well, it's in reference to Lawrence Lessig's pathetic dot theory, in which case there are four bodies, or four forces. These are markets, norms, architecture, and the law. We're setting up this piece by saying, actually, in crypto, the law is subtracted, and the three bodies that remain are markets, norms, and architecture.
Can you further describe what each of those, how we should think of each of those in the context of crypto, and also why you've abstracted away the law component from this discussion?
I can try and answer. So in Lotti classic model, there are these four forces that regulate the pathetic dot, which is us, the person subjected to regulatory forces all around. And so the markets obviously set prices and kind of regulate exchanges through price mechanisms. Norms kind of define what is socially admissible, like architecture kind of defines the flow of people and information in space, also digital architecture. And the law in his model kind of regulates also through all these forces. So the novelty of crypto is censorship resistant, which in a way is like a generalization perhaps of other kind of peer-to-peer technologies or like privacy models, and torrents, etc. And so this idea of censorship resistance or like introducing immutability and like a resistance to being shut down effectively, we interpreted that as a kind of law resistance. And so without this element of the law that perform this totalizing function on the other forces, we see in crypto these three forces become to operate on their own, or like obviously crypto protocols are digital software with market mechanisms. So here we have this very close synergy perhaps between markets and again like software kind of mechanisms, immutable again. And then the social norms in the space we saw as like being still very fragmented, or like there's a lot of subcultures in crypto. And it seemed to us that so far there hasn't really been a way for norms to kind of acquire a regulatory capacity on par with the other forces.
Real quick, with regards to the law piece, while law isn't something that is necessarily built into crypto and blockchain because it is a censorship-resistant, immutable thing, but I think in reality, what we have seen is that the law, various nations' laws, especially, I think this is felt especially hard in the US for people listening from the US, but I think it's hard to say that the law is fully abstracted from crypto because crypto is in fact very much affected, at least for people in the US or for people in countries that are not so crypto friendly, that the law actually plays a huge role in what we're able to do. I mean, I was just earlier before we started recording and Sam said there was a lag in my video. I was just saying, oh yeah, I forgot to turn my VPN off to be set somewhere else, right? So I think a lot of people experience this problem. So I'm just curious how you would respond to that of like the law not being part of crypto when it really does affect how we operate in crypto so much.
this was a heavy debate in like our writing process. I can say that for the first year of writing this, we were working with like this kind of visual analogy of game boards. And we had this idea of like game board 1, which is the regulatory environment described by Lessig, and game board 2, which is the new kind of behavioral dynamics and strategic landscape of crypto when this law dynamic is subtracted. And I think eventually we kind of hit the limits of this because we also did see that like the law, these game boards are really not entirely disconnected because the law kind of carves out certain possibility spaces for crypto to interact with. But there is a way in which they are still separate.
Let me just describe this from the protocol designer's standpoint. And, you know, if you listen to core dev calls, like they have a very explicit objectives to keep the protocol censorship resistant. And they try to measure the degree to which it is censorship resistant. I'm sure you've seen these kind of breakdowns of which nodes, which percent of the network is censoring. And, you know, this is a case for proof of work sometimes that it maybe has additional censorship resistant properties because the topology of the network and who is able to get transactions in at what times. So it is a very explicit objective to retain that property. And the degree to which the network is sovereign is really a measure of how it is able to retain that censorship resistance, particularly under duress. A successful blockchain will have a very strong censorship resistance. From the perspective of a user may not have access to chain itself. I mean, a government can restrict all internet access, and in which case you can't transact with blockchain. That's kind of outside of the purview to some extent, what the protocol is trying to address. You're using a VPN to access the blockchain, like that is using a complementary technology in order to override the network level censorship in order to interact with the consensus level non-censoring protocol. I know this is like a little bit splitting hairs here, but it's pretty important.
Yeah, no, I understand. I understand that. I think from just like a technical level, like if we're just talking about the like blockchain technology itself, does make sense to abstract away that law leg of, you know, to create this 3-body instead of a 4-body problem. So that, yeah, I totally understand that, but I can see how there were a lot of debates and discussions back and forth about whether to include that or not, how it applies. I definitely think it's a very nuanced topic and it's not very straightforward at all.
Yeah, I think the best way to think about it is like, what are the actual behaviors that are facilitated by blockchain? Like the behaviors that are within the scope of the protocol are different types of transactions. And as long as you actually have internet access to the blockchain, like if you send a transaction on a censorship resistant blockchain, like it will be deterministically processed. It will be included in a block. And like, that's the whole feature. That's why they exist. Other types of behaviors in and around blockchains, the core devs meeting itself or governance processes, like that's where the blockchains themselves like do not offer the same level of censorship resistance or the same level of protection or deterministic processing, and where confusions and complications start to arise.
Going back to crypto's 3-body problem that Laura was beginning to describe, then where is this, I guess, like, how would we describe in practical terms of what we experience today as the problems that we face because of this crypto's 3-body problem? And like, what is that current state that we're in?
So in the piece, we describe the problem actually as like a regression to the code. So because the law doesn't perform the same function of automatically kind of directing or maybe reinforcing also social norms in a certain ways, the stronger regulatory forces remain the programmable ones. So again, the architecture and the market incentives. In the piece, we went through a few examples of what we were seeing that for us was kind of illustrating these different balances. But at the end, it seems that the norms, when there is no explicit, more generally, I guess, the problem that crypto introduces also as an open kind of infrastructure is that social norms are actually recognized. They tend to follow the behaviors that are, directed by this combination of software and market incentives. I guess a good example we had is the example of NFT royalties and how while certain platforms or certain protocols, NFT exchanges were kind of integrating a royalties or a kickback to the artist, then because the architecture is actually open, other protocols or other platforms came about that could bypass these royalties, which is actually, I think, a normatively desirable, a desirable thing to have, that artists and creators get rewarded for their work. But again, since crypto affords this possibility to bypass the normative layer, there seems to be, this ultimate layer, regulatory layer that is created by the market and this programmable kind of mechanism. So,
yeah, I remember that example you guys included in the article, as well as I thought the ENS example was interesting too. For people who've been in the crypto Twitter world for a little while, you might remember when Brantley, who was the previous founding director or something like that at ENS, was essentially canceled on Twitter for things that he had said a while back. And the DAO voted to essentially remove him as director, but it turned out that he held enough votes, that the majority of votes, that no one could really take an action like that against him because he was the primary holder. I thought that was an interesting example as well. So from your view, I guess, what do you guys make of this? And what do you make of this? Because crypto is meant to be this fully decentralized thing. We talk about censorship resistance and all of this, but as we've seen play out, there are forces that influence how things actually work out in the crypto space that don't seem fully decentralized and fully aligned with those values that crypto and blockchain stand for.
I can speak to this. We just the implications are at length as well. And really what we concluded was there's kind of two paths for crypto governance more broadly. There's kind of a thin protocol direction that does really try to minimize the governance surface. And then there's kind of a more enriched, effectively a crypto native law type direction, which, we haven't really seen before. We have kind of glimmers of this in things like darknet market moderation, for instance. There's also kind of a iterative political and socio-technical governance. It does have a kind of self-reproducing and stable set of behaviors that it's enabled. You can either kind of go the Bitcoin route, or you can go something that is more articulated, but the in-between is really has perverse outcomes that are really hard to, they don't comport with what we would really understand as a decentralized governing system. It feels very much like a plutocracy.
Right. So I guess the next natural question is what solutions, how do we fix this? Right? What solutions do we have to this problem, if any?
And I think Sam kind of hinted at these two directions, but one is the enhancement of norms within the blockchain and crypto world in general, and to the point where self-regulation becomes a possibility. This was kind of the darknet markets moderation analogy. And yeah, we do see examples of this. And I think with the maturity of the space also comes the maturity of certain self-regulating features. Protocol Guild continues to get stronger. Potentially, there will be more crypto safety officers like Mr. Zach XBT in the future, potentially. But it would be encouraging to see. And we are seeing more kinds of public goods programs, which in a way incentivize certain types of good behavior around, commons code production, you could say. So that's, something we're enthusiastic about. That's within the fully on-chain environment, more or less. The other thing that we hope to see is a very different direction for crypto, which is a more integration with worlds and social scenes outside of how this space is conceived. Something that has been a theme across all of our essays since Squad Wealth is basically the importance of locality and shared space in terms of cultural formation. In Squad Wealth, we talked about how the squad, the prototypical squad, like needs to be closed off from the rest of the public web, the rest of the clear net, in order to like form its own vibes and its own kind of social norms and coherent sense of self. Its values, more or less, is another way of putting that, whether aesthetics or mimetic values or whatever. Positive Sum Worlds, our essay about public goods, we similarly talked about how a good, basically regional, it's basically pertains to some kind of group which is local in digital space or in physical space. But we talked about the challenges of digital space and how physical space it's almost much easier to figure out like what is in service of like a group of people who occupy a shared space. And with Three-Body Problem, we're kind of getting at something very similar, which is when you are operating in real world space, embodied space, it's much easier to define a set of concerns and share a set of norms that allow you to govern the use of resources and money. So the idea of like complementary currencies or local currencies has always been a big part of the crypto narrative, and especially the like Cosmos interchain story, but it's something that we haven't really seen come to fruition yet. Maybe that's becoming a lot more possible these days, but that's one example of, I think that's a rather abstract example. So it might, because most people have never really experienced what it is like to use a local currency, even though they've used crypto. Local financial systems like hollow funds or whatever that are governed by the social norms of like a given community rather than the norm demolishing, grain of the crypto space is kind of what we have in mind. And for that, we have to move this center of gravity of like, who are the users of crypto? How do we even think about crypto as a technology out of this disembodied space and into real place?
It does feel a little abstract still. I think I'm just trying to think of, a more tangible example to that, but it is, I think, yeah, sorry.
I mean, for example, like one of the things that has been an ongoing conversation in the United States, for example, is like the disempowerment of the Federal Reserve and the centralization of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve has like branches throughout the United States, and they're ultimately supposed to provide funds that will be used for like small business loans, for example. Instead, what's happening in the US for the last 10 years has been quantitative easing and then like major stimulus during the pandemic. So we have all of this money creation that then goes to that basically through what's called the Cantillon effect, like more or less gets transferred to wealth networks that are adjacent to the treasury and the big banks. So we end up with like inflation for the rest of the economy and not monetary policy and financial policy that will create wealth at a local level. So one of the questions you might ask is like, what are the kinds of financial systems that would help to stimulate the economy? Spread the Fed is like a meme and like a policy proposal that was created by like some kind of progressive leaning organizations a few years ago that didn't end up really becoming part of the Biden policy package. It was, an idea to more or less like re-decentralize the Federal Reserve, and instead of having the Federal Reserve of New York review every loan application, give that power back to like the Federal Reserve of St. Louis, the Federal Reserve of, I've actually forgotten where the other ones are, so you have to forgive me for that. So taking this idea and like porting it to a crypto analogy, like we have Compound, for example. Compound is a lending market. It's basically a bank, but it's like fully housed within this decentralized space of crypto. Could somebody figure out how to take that kind of thing, use crypto, or Maker might be another good example, like use these same technologies and ideas? Maybe you have to get a banking charter to do it, which costs a lot of money and it's certainly regulatorily onerous. Dramatically reduce the requirements and technical complexity of like giving out small business loans in some kind of local region. You could use crypto for that today if it weren't illegal. That's what I think the future looks like, is some kind of like hybrid mix. I don't know whether that's, 10 years away or 50 years away. I hope that's like an example of like the kind of policy effort, regulatory effort, and like technology build effort that's needed to take like what's going on in crypto and like take these kinds of liquidity dynamics, these kinds of wealth creation dynamics, and like put them in service of a community that's in like an actual place. Basically, what I said is like, it's as simple as small business loans, like on crypto rails. In order to have that, like you need to have a real community presence. Like that's what a mutual bank, that's what a mutual is, or like a credit union is. Like, why don't we just create, Compound is a credit union. So like, why don't we create a credit union like Compound, but like in Olympia, Washington, my hometown?
Just to elaborate on this a little bit, we're talking about trying to make the normative space more tangible and has core teeth in crypto. The only way to do that is to give people a stronger sense of connection to one another and to have them like affiliate with one another more closely, which is very easy to do in physical space around them. Like we just have a stronger sense of connection with neighbors. So there are different contexts or different ways in which you can try to achieve that, either in digital space or really instantiated in physical space. But like that really is the thing that's missing in crypto, is like you can only create norms that are enforceable in some way if you have consistent contact with someone, has kind of very strong sense of community affiliation. This kind of like free reign, permissionless, like degenerate world is just like kind of fully incompatible with that. So you gotta choose one or the other, really.
So are you arguing then, Sam, that we have to, I feel like we're getting into the realm of like on-chain culture a little bit. And it sounds like you're kind of calling out some of these more degenerate communities, more of like I feel like in this space, I mean, you have so many subcultures at this point, but if you were to kind of categorize like the main categories, you have sort of like the more degenerate community that is really focused on finance and tokens and things like that. And then you have, I would say, more of like the newer wave of people, the more recent wave of people who've come into the space that are more focused on culture and community, and maybe some of the things that it sounds like you're advocating for as like things that we need in order to influence the social norms part of this crypto's three-body problem to push us in the direction that we need to go.
I'm not trying to make too much of a normative statement here. This is really an analysis. Like, have nothing wrong with full degeneracy. Like, if the objective is to actually use norms as a regulatory force, you can only do so much in this like fully censorship resistant, like global kind of evacuated space. Norms, are much more powerful in local context. And so, maybe these projects will have more success. I think there's it remains to be seen how much of an affiliation and like a true connection these projects can make. I haven't seen anything that really has caught my attention in terms of what it's doing to make people, to really enhance like bonds of friendship and trust and these things that are critical for the development of strong norms.
Yeah. Do you guys feel pretty optimistic that we will be able to get to a state where social norms are strong enough to influence, to sort of replace the law with social norms? Do you guys are you feeling optimistic about that? Because to me, that sounds like a pretty bold statement and a pretty risky thing to rely on, of like this shift of social norms and relying on people to sort of self-police themselves and things like that. Like that, at least from what I've seen, like in the US, like I'm not super optimistic about something like that.
Well, let's just be clear. Like the law is also made of norms, like there's nothing magic about the law. Like it's just people coming together and creating strong norms. And there's issues with the law, but we've demonstrated it's possible. So we know that it can be a very powerful tool. It just needs to be exercised correctly. And again, we're not trying to say one way or the other, like this should happen. Like we're just trying to provide a framework for people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think another like potential danger of sort of letting people develop those norms is that what can maybe tend to happen is that those with the most power will dictate what the norms are.
I mean, you're definitely misunderstanding. There's a lot of different regimes we're talking about here. Like there's crypto, and like within crypto, degeneracy will never go away, and like lawlessness will never go away. because censorship resistant will always exist to some degree, just like torrents. There will also probably increasingly be this like wise counsel type of dynamic where certain people like manage to create normative like barriers against like the worst of those tendencies, or scope out spaces that are free of the worst of those tendencies. That can happen via a combination of like, it happens via a combination of like cultural posturing and like alliance of people who agree to like come into that kind of dynamic, like protocol guild, benevolent dictatorship, like, what the Ethereum Foundation does. In the world of reality, where like crypto meets reality in some kind of like local way, we are not advocating that like law should not exist. Obviously, the people who do anything in that place will be subject to law. And therefore, like the law will have a much stronger impact on like what they think is normatively acceptable. That doesn't mean that they can't also sovereignly choose the economic system that they like want to participate in. What crypto provides for is like the ability to not have the law reach into that economic system and expropriate their assets or tell them they can't organize in a certain way, as long as they're not defrauding people or rugging people, like in which case like they will get sued. The law will continue to apply to people as it continues to apply to people who even rug people in crypto. As if you aren't good at covering your tracks, like you'll get sued, maybe do jail time. There's a lot more nuance here than like you just made it out to be.
Yeah, no, I apologize for that too. I wasn't trying to make it too black and white. That I gotcha. I think that makes a lot of sense. And there's absolutely a lot of nuance there, a lot of gray area. And I understand like you guys are just providing an analysis. You're not arguing a certain point or a position or anything like that. So appreciate you clarifying that, Toby. So I know Laura, I saw you unmute earlier. I didn't know if you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I think Toby explains the nuances very, very well. Like, yeah, the only other thing that maybe I would add is that we're also talking about, crypto meeting existing communities and not communities that form around a token or a particular infrastructure, but places on the ground, communities that already have certain sets of established norms that, respect the law in the jurisdiction in the usual ways, that they can add also the, historicity to certain ways of dealing things socially that crypto just doesn't have because it's such a young thing.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I want to move on, and I wanted to give Sam a chance to discuss this tweet that he put out that I saw recently and thought was quite potentially controversial, quite fiery, let's just say. And Sam, the tweet that I'm referencing is you said, all these try-hard on-chain culture plays are completely soulless, like ad agency pitches looking for corporate sign-off. Base probably the worst offender. Cultural wasteland, TBH. So I imagine most people, yeah, I mean, I would love for you to take a moment to sort of provide more context and explain what you meant by that.
I mean, I feel like it's pretty self-explanatory. Like, there's almost nothing in crypto that is like legitimately cool or like heartfelt. You're typically being sold to, it's kind of it when you see it. Like, when you do see the exception, it's like very obvious. Like, somebody just put a lot of time into this. They care. The outcome, it's like the economic substrate is a means to ends, and the ends is like it's bringing someone joy, or just deploying something, putting something out there that's like really weird or really fucked up, or just like, they're kind of pushing the envelope in some way. And that is the mark of, a cultural movement, when you have that kind of richness of novelty and like human personality that's put into the work. And yeah, just not a lot of that in crypto. Doesn't really need to be collaborative too much further.
Can you give some examples of people, projects, whatever, that you think are actually pushing the envelope, doing things to enhance culture?
I try to promote these projects and people to the extent that I can. I think there's a subset of NFT artists that are doing some really interesting work. I have done a bunch of work with kind of community of like conceptual artists that includes folks like Rhea Myers, Michelle F. Chan, and Brian Fry, the Terra Zero folks. Like, these are, friends of mine, but like we became friends because there was like an immediate like doing really interesting work, and that just initiated the dialogue. There are now these kind of like broader, like we're going to create a social network on the crypto things, Lens, Cardcaster, etc. And I, applaud the effort. There's still a long way to go for these projects. I don't find myself like really wanting to spend time in those spaces. It feels like somebody's just kind of hawking their goods. I don't see a lot of like long form dialogue or just like very nuanced, articulation of like a unique subculture. It's just kind of like, I'm going to create an AI generated like series of 1,000 and like try to make a product.
Yeah, I hear you on that. And shout out to Mitchell Chan too, longtime friend in the pod, as well as Sarah Mayovas. She's an artist that I think fits into that category that you're describing as well. To your last statement, I think a lot of people would say that, and this is going to spark a lot. It's like, please respond to all of this. But I think, a lot of the rhetoric nowadays is onboarding the next billion to crypto, right? Reaching the masses with crypto. I know this is all probably like triggering some sort of nerve in you. So I look forward to your response. But I'm just saying this is like the rhetoric that we hear most often in the space now. And some people would argue that, for example, Base is doing an excellent job in that regard of bringing crypto to the masses, actually building easy to use tools that people who aren't exposed to the crypto world yet can easily onboard onto and use. How would you respond to all of this? And maybe even starting with the beginning of like the fact that everybody is talking about onboarding the next billion to the space, building in the space. Like, what feelings or reactions does that bring about in you guys?
I know you guys want to take this one. Go for it.
Well, I guess it goes back to what we were saying about like crypto, like joining like a broader kind of cultural like ecologies. So the space as this separated, disembodied, abstract thing, it's probably, I would say, also reached its limit. Like the pandemic is over. There's only, people also want to meet and collaborate in real life, in the physical spaces. They want to make place rather than just this abstract space. So I think that maybe for people to onboard the next billion, it will need to get out of its space as well a little bit. And like, again, what we were saying before in terms of like start engaging people where they're at in their actual world. So
less of this like global digital space, more of these localized communities and localized cultures and subcultures. Right, so
how about instead of onboarding people, offboarding crypto?
Yeah, I like that. Because that essentially is what people are saying, right? Like the UX has to get better. The crypto part has to be abstracted away from all of these apps so that people can use it. So really it is about offboarding crypto more so than onboarding the masses. No, I like that framing. Any final thoughts from you guys before we wrap up here?
Yes, I just wanted to plug a book that we're working on. And this is kind of our big project right now. We go into a lot of what we've just discussed and a lot more. We get kind of like a full insider look at other internet as an organization, like do a little bit of a history, but like also kind of like somebody else wanted to start another internet. Like, how would you do that? But we want to make kind of open source that information so that we could see a lot more cool young groups, help them grow. So we're super excited to kind of make some progress on that. And we're hoping to have it get out by the end of the year.
Amazing. Toby, you had something as well?
That's it. I was only also going to show the book. I'll say that, Sam and Laura and I have been writing together for like coming up. We're about to hit our like 5-year anniversary of like work together basically, or go into year 5 more or less. Yeah, it's really like from that ongoing process that like a lot of other things happened, but a lot of other things that like weren't really visible to the public eye did happen. Also we had like, projects that we did with Uniswap and Pool Together and Optimism. We have had like a ton of like different weird engagements with like the arts world. And we had like, researchers in residence. And I think a lot of the cool things that we did and a lot of the internal like education initiatives that we did like have never been entirely visible to people until now. Yeah, so watch out for the forthcoming Other Internet anthology title TBD that we'll be announcing subscribe to the Internet Substack so you can hear about that.
Amazing. I will link the Substack. I'll link the 3-body problem article that we talked about for the bulk of this conversation in the show notes to make it easy for people to find. Yeah, sorry we didn't really get to talk about the history of other internet so much. I've kind of I've heard you talk, Toby, you talk about it a bunch on various podcasts. And so I kind of already had it in the back of my mind. And I know that information is out there for people who want to know, but really excited to, hear read the full story in this book that you guys are working on that's coming out later. Last thing, while we're talking about links and all of that, tell people where they can find the 3 of you personally. 2 of you would like to follow you personally. I know you all have your personal projects as well. So let people know what's the best way to find each of you personally. Don't be shy now.
Okay, somebody jump. I guess I will. I'm a Toby Shorin on Twitter. I have too many websites. TobyShorin.com is the one that contains all of them.
Perfect.
Lottiland on Twitter, and then I have a website which is lotti.xyz, and that's different contacts.
Perfect. And Sam.
And I am HXRTS on Twitter, and website is HXRTS. Yeah, you can find links to all the stuff I work on.
Awesome. I will link all of those in the show notes to make it easy for people to click through to. Thank you all. Thank you so much for taking the time today. I'm so glad we were able to make this happen with all 3 of you. I know we had to work across time zones and things like that. So a shout out to the localized communities, but also shout out to internet and being able to speak globally to people without having to, fly all 4 of us to one central location. So really appreciate you guys taking the time. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you, Rehash.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Rehash. Rehash is hosted and produced by me, Diana Chen. Rehash is also supported by our community of NFT holders who curate our guest lineup each season. To get involved, head over to our website at rehashweb3.xyz and collect this episode as an NFT. Anyone who collects an episode becomes part of the Rehash community and will be able to nominate guests for future seasons. To learn more about how to become a guest on the podcast, go to rehashweb3.xyz/podcast. And to learn more about sponsoring the podcast, go to rehashweb3.xyz/sponsor. Finally, be sure to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at rehashweb3 or on Warpcast and Lens at Rehash. And join our community on Telegram at t.me/rehashweb3. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. See you next week.